Welcome to this Moving Panels One Shot. Let's have a nerdy little conversation. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and we are continuing our summer series on the mind behind some of the most, I guess you would say, provocative comics in a recent era, and that, of course, is Mark Millar. And so far this summer, we've talked about who Mark Millar is. We kicked things off with a full episode on his first adaptation, which was Wanted, the movie Wanted. And if you haven't listened to those yet, go back, catch up. But today, we are going to pull back the curtain on some of the big themes that run throughout much of Millar's work. And that's the politics, the social commentary, and the way that he uses his comics to reflect and sometimes critique the world that we live in. And joining me on this journey is someone who always brings the fire when we dig into deeper topics. Please welcome Justin Baker.
Thank you for having me, Larry.
Oh, you are quite welcome. Curious, since this is the first time I'm having you're going to come on later to talk about. You and I are going to talk about Kick-Ass, another Mark Millar work. I got to remember it's Millar.
Millar.
It's Miller.
Millar.
It's
Miller.
It's Miller. I did learn it's Miller. How familiar are you with his work, whether comic book or the movies?
So I have watched Civil War. I've heard of Red Son, Superman Red Son. I've really heard of a lot of his stuff, but I honestly just didn't know it was all tied to him.
Yeah. So you're familiar with his work. You just weren't until you and I started preparing for this episode. There was a lot of stuff where you was like, "Oh, I didn't realize that was."
Yeah, I didn't realize he was
Millar.
The spider who created this tangled web that has been woven for us to dissect.
Yep. So let's get into it. So let's first just talk about the fact of this, political and social commentary. So whether you're familiar with his graphic novels or with the movies that are adapted from his graphic novels, you can clearly tell that he loves to push buttons. Mm-hmm. So let's go into that. So do you think he's actually trying to make these political and social statements? Like, is he doing it on purpose? Is it intentional? Or do you think it's just a byproduct of the stories that he tells?
To me, I feel it's more of a byproduct. He's there hovering around the button. He might push the button a little bit. But to me, I think it's the story, it's the overall theme that he has, and politics, social issues, economic issues, all these little life decisions that we make in our lives. I feel like that's what it really boils down to. Like, Mark Millar is, like, all his stories are about choices.
Oh, yeah, I will agree with you on that. But you think that the actual, like, political and social commentary is just something that organically happens. It's not something that he's intentionally putting into the story.
I would say some of his stories, it is intentional, but I think for the most part, I would say majority, it feels to me as it's organic.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, I actually think it's intentional. Just so this will be an interesting conversation. But yeah, I think that if you look at, just go back to the episode from last week. We talked about Wanted. To me, that especially the comic more so, I think is just full of cynical commentary about the fact that we live in a world that is secretly run by villains, people with no morals. And that even though our world is run by people with no morals, we accept it. Mm-hmm. And I honestly think, and you did say that you think it does happen in some, but I think with something like Wanted, like, it's not subtle. Yeah. It's clear that is the story, that is the message he is telling in that comic book.
I feel like it's like Wanted is a great example of, he's definitely pushing the buttons. He's wanting to send out his message. And then others, he's kind of covering it up a little bit. You have to dig a little deeper to find out, those social political issues that he's talking about.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's go through a list. We're not gonna do every single one of his graphic novels, but I've got a list of a few that I believe that he is trying to say something. And again, like you say, it may have been just a byproduct. It may have been just a natural thing that happened with the story he's telling, but I'm going to give my impression of it. And of course, Justin, as always, you can, we can debate this, but let's talk about probably the most obvious one. And that is Marvel's Civil War.
Good.
The whole Civil War storyline. So we've got the Superhuman Registration Act. For those of you who don't know, that's what it is in the comics. There is no, my mind just went blank. Sokovia Accords, like there is in the movies. It's the Superhero Registration Act. Pretty much all superheroes are required by law to reveal their identities to the government, and then they can only work for the government.
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, they had to be members of S.H.I.E.L.D., they got payroll, benefits.
Yeah, pretty much, again, they had to work for the United States government. And you had Iron Man, who takes the side of, yes, this is what needs to happen, this is the best way for us to do our job. And then Captain America says, no, this is wrong. This is... again, you're talking about a man who fought in World War II, but you could also look at it as this storyline started in 2006. So we're in a post 9/11 world where there is now the Patriot Act. And so there is in our, we take aside the World War II and the fact that, the Jewish people had to register and all that within that timeline. Our current timeline, there is a conflict between freedom and security. And I think, unlike with World War II, I think that this Civil War story works so well because really there is no villain. Iron Man and Captain America both have valid points. And so Millar is capturing essentially this political polarization that we go through in the United States. Democrat, Republican. And, there are times where each side has a valid point, but people choose one side or the other, and they fight for their side. And so it truly shows that the time that we live in and how messy the political choices are that we make.
You're taking the words right out of my mouth. To me, this really shown the political divide in our nation. Because you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat, I don't like you, or vice versa. I would actually argue with you on this point of there is a villain, and that is that we become the villain. That through their choices, Millar's, I said his kind of theme is one of the things I noticed with him, and this is my ELA teacher coming out. His theme is personal choices, that all the characters make these small little choices of, what battle am I going to pick and choose? Captain America's saying, I've seen this before in Germany, I know what's right. And basically they are, drawing the line. This is what I'm going to fight for. And, those political decisions become beliefs. And then, look at the outcome. You have literally a civil war. You're tearing up the streets of New York, all in the name of, I'm doing this for the people. And then who's the one to stop them in the end?
Yeah, I could see some. Again, that's why I think it's one of the reasons why it's called a civil war. So
to me,
I totally agree with that.
That name kind of came out to not just a civil war of we're splitting superheroes, but to me, it felt like an internal civil war.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, let's move on. You brought up Superman Red Sun, so let's talk about that one. This one, I think you could maybe argue that his commentary, the message he was trying to convey was maybe a little bit more subtle. I think Red Sun is, I mean, honestly, it's like a full-blown thought experiment. So it's not whereas Civil War was a little bit more upfront. Superman Red Sun is not about communism versus capitalism, as many people would think, but it's more about how an ideology can twist even the most good people.
Yeah,
people who have good intentions can still be persuaded and swayed by ideology. And so in this one, you've got Superman landing in Soviet Russia instead of, middle of America, Kansas. He lands in Soviet Russia. He becomes a Soviet figurehead. The U.S. kind of becomes paranoid about this super being that is with the Soviets, and they become a counterforce against that. And so in this one, Millar is using an alternate history of the comics to show, or to ask, I would say, if morality is something that is universal, or is morality something that is shaped by, the world that you are born into? Is Superman Superman because that's who he is? Or is it because that is how he was raised?
See, you're once again getting all the stuff that I...
well, but again, I think that's because we're seeing what Millar is trying to say through these stories.
It's a very philosophical question. Once again, I agree with you. It's not about communism versus democracy or communism capitalism. To me, what stood out was especially as teachers, we kind of see, kids, and as they grow, they're becoming their own, and, the outside forces that sway their decisions come back to Millar and his choices. Superman was always trying to do what he thought was for the best. And that's kind of what stood out to me in Red Sun, was he was trying to do good in what was in his heart or in his mind.
Yes.
And like you said, the ideology, to me, kind of what came across is, yes, the people who raise you, the world that you live in, can have a, intrinsic force on you, and they can sway you, but you are always going to be you. Superman is always going to be Superman. He was always trying to do what he thought was best for everybody. Might not have been the best thing, not been what everybody wanted, but that was one thing that kind of stuck out to me was, even though he was raised by completely different people, he grew up on the whole other side of the world, he was still trying to do what he thought was right. He was still fighting for the forces of good. He wasn't really the bad guy.
Or at least what he perceived as good. Because I think another thing Millar's doing in Red Sun is it's a criticism, a critique, I guess you would more say, of how propaganda works. And how power corrupts. And I think that's part of that story. Again, how much of I think in this case it is like how much of that was intentional, or how much of that just naturally came out of the story. You could make that argument.
And I mean, to me, I feel like Millar's writing comes off layers. It's like Shrek. It's like an onion. You get for Superman Red Son, for the kids, it's almost like a what if. What if Superman didn't grow up in Kansas? What if his spaceship landed in communist Russia? Ooh, that sounds interesting. Yeah. But as you grow older, you get to see the ideology, maybe you kind of see that, communism versus capitalism issue there. You get to see good versus evil there. You get to see the internal struggle and the external struggles that he has to go through. And that's what I love about his writing, is it's so much of, you peel back the layer almost every time you read or watch anything he's written.
Yeah, no, I think that's what, I've seen like things on social media, especially like TikTok, that talk about, there are some book lovers, quote unquote, who honestly look down at graphic novels and comic books because they don't look at them as a pure form of literature. Mm-hmm. But man, when you're talking about these stories, and I mean, I could bring up other things about, commentary that Frank Miller has made in some of his works, and Alan Moore has made in some of his works, but we're talking about Mark Millar. When you're talking about this, like how can you not put this on the same level as like, just coming to mind, Kurt Vonnegut.
That's good, yeah.
Yeah, because like I said, especially
Slaughterhouse-5.
Yeah, books like Fahrenheit 451. That have that. George Orwell's 1984. Right. These books that have that social and political commentary that is within them, and it just so happens that Mark Millar is able to do that within the world of superheroes. Mm-hmm. But let's move on. So let's see how much more we can get out of this. So, for those of you that don't know, Mark Millar is the main brain behind the Ultimates, another universe that was created within Marvel that primarily was the inspiration of the MCU. But in the Ultimates, they're a little bit more. It's a little darker, because this is as if the Avengers are more of a arrogant, almost like a militarized version of the Avengers. And it plays with the idea of really America, again, post 9/11, foreign policy, America thinking that they're the almighty power in the world. And so the Avengers in the Ultimates act more as like enforcers. Mm-hmm. And these books, because there's the Ultimates is the Avengers, but then there's Ultimate Fantastic Four, Ultimate X-Men, that kind of live within the same world. But these books almost dare you to be uncomfortable with how casual the heroes are with just the use of their power. Mm-hmm. And even a character like Captain America, it's almost like he has blinders on, and it's this is what I'm here to do, and he's not as open-minded as the Captain America that we really know from the comics.
The Ultimates came across, I didn't get to dive into them as much. My actual first foray was, I think, an X-Men video game where your skins, you could unlock the Ultimates. And it was, so different and intrigued me. But two things that stood out to the Ultimates for me was, and now I'm having a moment where I can't even think of my first one, but I'll jump to my second one, was, I just remembered it. So you can edit out my brain fart there. So my first point was the show The Boys. It was almost like if superheroes were real, what would it be like in real life? And they would almost come across as militaristic. They're going to be the cops. It came across as very have and have nots. We have the superpowers, you don't, so we're the bullies. You're going to fall in line. And the other thing is, like you were talking about with America being, numero uno in the world, is it kind of came across as the superheroes are almost viewed as like nuclear weapons. It's a deterrent. No one's going to mess with us because probably 90% of superheroes are in the United States. So, to me, it kind of came across as, when you have the power, you're afraid to lose it. Use it or lose it is kind of the message that came with the Ultimates for me.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons I followed this up after Red Sun, because it's almost that same idea. It's the country that controls Superman has the potential to control the world. And so in the Ultimates, he's kind of telling that same thing through, the country who can group the heroes together as the Avengers and ultimately make them their police force. They're the ones that will control the world. So, yeah, it's a great one there.
Mm-hmm. And let me just say, how often do you get a writer who can bounce back between Marvel and DC worlds and write so fantastically?
Yeah. Even though Millar's done most of his work through Marvel, the few things he's done with DC hold up just as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on. Let's talk about what we're actually going to cover next week, and that's Jupiter's Legacy, which some of you might be familiar with the Netflix series. But Jupiter's Legacy deals more with that generational conflict. The older idealistic generation in those heroes, and then that is going up against the younger group that looks at the world as flawed and think that it needs to be handled differently from a superhero standpoint. And so then he gets into questioning what is heroism. How do we define moral leadership? And so I think it is a commentary on the inherited values. So this kind of even goes back to Red Sun a little bit. The inherited values and whether or not doing the quote unquote right thing is enough in a flawed, corrupted world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how everything kind of goes back to the right thing, as you said. Yeah. I see it every day at work, generational thoughts. Go talk to your parents or grandparents, if they're still alive, and you can see that generational gap, that viewpoint, that they're really just that point of view. What your grandparents or parents didn't think was a problem, you might be sitting there like, I don't know about that. That seems a little, you can't do that anymore. And, that the little bit of Jupiter's Legacy I got to dive into, that's kind of my takeaways. Like you said, it's that generational gap of what the older generations were doing, not really what the younger generation wants to do. They can see the flaws in, well, this is how we've always done things. Well, it doesn't mean it's the right way to do it.
Yeah. In other words, the quote unquote right thing evolves in a manner of speaking. I'd still think there is right and wrong, but to probably more play into what I'm trying to get across here. And again, the both of us being teachers, we both experienced this. Obviously cell phones, and as they became a bigger thing, you had the old generation of teachers and parents that are saying, we should not have cell phones. They shouldn't have cell phones are corrupting them. And it's, it's hurting education. And although I don't disagree with that, I don't fully agree with it either. I think that, and I know a lot of schools have done this, you adapt to it. Okay, cell phones are a thing. We are not going to be able to get rid of them. So how can we use them to, to foster learning and, have them work for education? And at the same time, then parents have to also get across what is the right and appropriate use of a phone, versus what is the, inappropriate and the wrong thing to do with the phones. And so I still think there's a right and a wrong, but I think the right and the wrong has to adapt to our generation, our world, and our time. And of course, now we're getting into a world that AI exists. And so it's a matter of, what is right and wrong uses of AI. And so that's more of where I think there is still a right and a wrong to everything, but there has to be, there has to be an evolution to that. I mean, me as a math teacher, this will be mine. You got to think that, when the calculator came along, the older generation who was still using an abacus, it's like, well, that's not, we were able to do that without just pushing some buttons. And it's like, I get that, but now this is a thing. So now we have to learn how to use this thing.
Or back when, I'm a little bit younger than you, is you're not always going to have a calculator in your pocket. Well, now you got cell phones.
I remember that. Yeah. Yeah. Or when you learn cursive and it was like, this is how you write when you get older. No, it's not.
No, it's just how you sign your name on all the forms when you buy a house and a car and all that.
Yeah.
Totally not going to need it.
Yeah. But, so that's where I kind of go with that. So tune in next week. We'll go a little bit deeper into Jupiter's Legacy. So that one's to come. But let's move on to one that I will go ahead and say, I know Justin does not know about this one. This one's never been adapted into a movie or television show. But I wanted to bring it up, and that is a book called Nemesis that was written by Mark Millar. And so just to let Justin and everybody know who's not familiar with Nemesis, the premise of Nemesis is it's a billionaire. Let's see if this sounds familiar. It's a billionaire using his resources, but in Millar's book, he's using it for chaos instead of justice.
The anti-Bruce Wayne.
So we can talk about millionaires and billionaires using their wealth for good versus evil. But this is definitely Millar taking a twist on class privilege and the idea of the untouchable elite. And essentially what I believe is he's asking in Nemesis is, what if Batman was a sociopath, which some people might argue he is, but what if Batman was a sociopath and nobody could stop him? And that's what Nemesis is.
Now you make me want to go read that.
But again, I think it's that we go back to the stories like in Civil War and Red Sun of the political power and how power corrupts. And now you've got this book about what if a billionaire who has all this power and these resources available to him, what if he just decides to go crazy? But it's taking that twist of like, what if Batman was the Joker?
Well, I'll put that on my TBR.
Yeah. What if the Joker had all of the resources that Batman has and all of the power that Batman has, the intellect, which, some people would argue the Joker does have that intellect, but yeah, that's Nemesis. All right, let's move on to some that's probably a little bit more familiar to people, and let's do one that we will talk about later in this summer series, and that is Kick-Ass. So obviously this is a very almost reminiscent of Alan Moore's Watchmen in the fact that it is clearly, a different take on superheroes. But in this work of Mark Millar's, it's kind of just a brutal look at heroism in a real world. And of course, when I look at it, I see that he's definitely telling a story that is commenting on the influence of social media, from the way that Kick-Ass gets famous. Of course, there is the commentary about violence itself. And I think he's even telling a story about adolescent fantasies.
Yeah, what I loved about Kick-Ass was it was a mix of teenage angst with the violent. I mean, it was just everything we've talked about, but make it a teenager. You know, and all the troubles that you kind of have in your teens and, you know, college days. It's just, that's what Kick-Ass was to me. Was, you know, going back to choices, to, you know, him, you know, choosing to be a superhero. Why is there, you know, superheroes when you got supervillains? And then, you know, like you said, violence. I mean, in the movie, first scene, you have violence, grotesque violence of, you know, we don't see that side in superhero stories all too much of, you got all these superpowers, you can, you know, punch somebody to the moon, what would it actually look like?
Yeah, except he's going away from just superpowers. You know, what if just the regular average person, you know, decided that they wanted to fight against, you know, criminals and mobsters? Could one person really fight off, you know, a gang of, you know, 3 or 4 individuals? Or what if just, you know, average Joe Schmo dude decided to go after the mob? And so, yeah, it is that idea. Essentially, he's saying that the idea of wanting to become a superhero is not only just a delusion, but it's probably the most dangerous delusion.
Absolutely.
And like you talked about that first scene in the movie, which is from the comic. And again, we'll talk about more about this. You and I will when we cover this movie in the month of July. But, you know, the guy on the roof thinking, hey, you know, I've built this suit with wings. I should be able to fly. And of course, that's not the case. And so, yeah, and then, you know, we see all the stuff that happens to Dave, and we see what happens to Big Daddy. And yeah, I think he's saying, you know, and this goes back to, again, intentions. These people may have good intentions, but they are delusional thinking that they can do this. But at the same time, and this is where I just think the depth of Mark Millar comes in. At the same time, I think he's also giving a message about the, what word am I looking for? Desensitization. Of violence.
Just get so used to it. I mean, even watching the movie, I was just like, yeah, I've seen that before.
Yeah, and again, I don't think Mark Millar, if he had written this stuff in the 80s, and I know people could argue Alan Moore and Frank Miller did some of this in the 80s, but I don't think you could have had his movies, or excuse me, his novels getting adapted into movies in the 80s or possibly even in the 90s because of the amount of violence. I think that because we have become so desensitized to violence, we're able to see these. But I mean, you read, they're more violent in the actual graphic novel. We'll just say that. And that's in the case in just about all of these. But I think in Kick-Ass especially, I think he is saying some sort of message about the see if I can get this word out, desensitization of violence, and almost the glorification of vigilante justice.
Oh yeah, I mean, think how many superheroes and how many TV shows have we had made that are that vigilante style superhero? I mean, we just had the whole thing on Green Arrow. And they did that spin of vigilante. Or
even if it's not going the superhero route, you know, you've got shows, and I know this is also based off a book series, but you've got, you know, the Jack Reacher, you know, shows that in a way he is a vigilante. Or, you know, they do kind of work it where he is working with the police, or like Tracker on CBS. It's that same idea. I mean, I watch a show like that, and I always find it funny when Coulter pulls out his gun right next to the police, and the police don't even question the fact that this, you know, this random tracker dude is walking in, you know, carrying, you know, some of the stuff he gets away with, even when he's working with, or I guess you would say adjacent to the police, but they're not necessarily superheroes or, you know, masked crime fighters, but I think it's still that same vigilante justice that you get out of, like I said, these shows like Reacher and Tracker. So, all right, let's move on to one of, in my opinion, one of his greatest works, and that is Old Man Logan, which was a lot of the inspiration to the movie Logan, although slightly different, because in Old Man Logan, we are in a post-apocalyptic dystopian world, and we get that, and then we cross it with, and what if superheroes just decided to give up? So it's looking, so I think that's what Millar is showing, is what if the good guys just said, I'm just tired of fighting. Like, it's not working. We fight against evil. We might win, but then evil always comes back. And, so what's the point of fighting? And they just let evil win. And so I think that not only is that part of the commentary, I think that there's the commentary on aging, on complicity, and honestly, kind of going back to Superman, even though this was Wolverine, Logan, that idea of, is it worth having hope when you live in a world in which everything is always going wrong? Like, what is the cost of hope? And so I think that there's that level that it's being told in that story. I also think there's underneath that, there's, regret. There is the burden of what happens when you survive something so terrible, but the people who you believed were much better than you didn't.
Survivor's guilt, almost.
Yeah. Because you've got that case where here's Wolverine, but then you're looking at all these other, X-Men and Avenger characters that all died, in some cases because they didn't give up, in other cases just because they were just doing what they always did, and eventually it cost them. Again, another great story. I think it is there. How familiar are you with Old Man Logan?
I've seen the movie a couple of times. I haven't read the graphic novel.
Highly recommend it.
But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a lot of the same themes we've talked about. Like you talked about aging, kind of generational gaps with 23. I'd kind of say also, to me, mental health a little bit with Charles Xavier and everything he goes and how he's kind of treated in there. But the biggest one I'd have to agree with you is hope. How long are you willing to hold on to hope? And what are you going to do to, make that decision? What do you think is the right thing? And, what are you going to do? And the perseverance to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, to tackle one more, and this is one that I really strongly wanted to put in for this summer, but we won't be able to get to it this summer. But maybe we'll do a March Madness that pits this against something, or I might just set aside a whole month just to talk about the Kingsmen. So you got the Kingsmen, Secret Service. This one, I think, probably more so than any of his other works, is clearly a satire. He is obviously kind of, this is his take on the, the spy genre. But at the same time, it's about elitism. It's about class-based power. We get a working class recruit who is going up against a world of old money. And espionage, essentially essentially what he's telling is that real strength doesn't come from your breeding, it doesn't come from money, but it comes from grit and perspective. And so he uses this story to essentially poke fun at the upper class, at the snobbery of the upper class, but at the same time, he's indulging in that spy genre, especially the the excesses of the spy genre. So what are your thoughts about The Kingsman?
Such a good one. I've only seen the first one, haven't seen the second one or read any of them, but love the first one. Definitely have to agree. It's a jab at socioeconomic troubles. Hard working class. It's hard work, determination. Can get you very far. Agree with you. Youth versus that's that generational thing again. Youth versus old money. What you see as right might not be the new right. Kind of how you go about things. To me, also, anybody can be the hero. The main character. I mean, he was really a nobody, and he goes from zero to hero.
But he's done that. I mean, that was the case in Wanted. That was the case in Kick-Ass. I mean, he's done that a lot of taking the nobody and turning them into the main character, hero, if you will. Although hero is kind of a tricky word when you're talking about a lot of Mark Millar's work. So let me ask you, do you think any of these, or if there's another one that we didn't talk about that you want to bring up, do you think any of these were more successful in delivering their message? Or did you think that maybe they, tried too hard, didn't try hard enough? What are your thoughts? Is there anything that you think does the best job at relaying that message?
I would honestly have to say, to me, Civil War and Red Sun are probably the most on the nose. He's trying to send a message. The others, it kind of depends on how deep you want to dig. How are you willing to peel back the onion and see the layers in his work? Even like we said, Kingsman, which is clearly a satire, has its own layers, and you could do a whole, like you said, a whole episode on it and the socioeconomic jabs that it's taking there. But I think it's just kind of what mood are you in to look at it, and then kind of what out of that bag of themes is he going for? How deep did he want to write about it? Did he want to leave it on the surface, or did he want to make you think about it?
All right. So with that being said, this is the last little section we want to discuss before we'll wrap up this episode. So let's talk about kind of what you're talking about. The intent versus the impact. So I agree that sometimes Millar comes across like he's just, going after the big, almost controversial story, and maybe the message is a little bit buried underneath there. So, you've kind of already answered this, but just to go in a little bit more depth, do you think that the political and social commentary always lands? Or, and this is where I'm going to kind of reword and redirect this conversation, do you think sometimes the shock value, the violence that is in a lot of Mark Millar's work, do you think that it drowns out the message, the commentary?
That's a good question. The movie that's standing out to me right now is Kick-Ass. The first time I watched it, did not pick up on any of it. I just thought it was a good blend of teenage angst and a superhero origin movie. Did not get the underlying message about violence and desensitization. See, I can't say it either. So you got me tongue-tied.
It's a hard word.
Desensitization of violence there. Whew. It took me another watch to kind of really peel back that onion, whereas Civil War, I immediately, I could ramble off without even having watched the movie in probably 6-7 years or read the graphic novel. I could list you off all the themes all the messages, all the things that he's wanting to talk about. Kind of same with Red Suns. Like, the first time I ever heard of it, I was like, oh, that sounds like an interesting what if. Like, it's like a DC version of Marvel What If. But then...
what they call that Elseworld.
Okay. But then when I dug into it, I could see, socio-economic divide. I could see all the different stripes that he's trying to get at. I think it's just, like I said earlier, it's just, where did he decide to plant for each one? And it's honestly, he's all of his stuff, it's the more you read it, the more you watch it, the more you're going to find out.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think the best example is Wanted. And it could be that it's still fresh on my mind from where we discussed it last week. But I think because in a way it's just your usual revenge fantasy story, but it's rough. I mean, there's a lot, but if you dig deep into it, like you're saying, you realize that it's a critique of complacency. It deals with the mediocrity. Essentially what I think Millar is saying in Wanted is you can take control of your life as long as you're willing to be a monster. And it's not a positive message, but it's a message. And, and if you look at his books, like, Kick-Ass, and then I brought up earlier Nemesis, where the violence is so over the top. I mean, you can throw Kingsman in there as well. I think, like you said, sometimes it does overshadow his point. Because, again, I'm still standing by that he is putting that in there intentionally. So is Millar critiquing society's love of violence, or is he reveling in the love of violence?
That is a good one. The image that kind of comes to me is I feel like he knows that we love it. It's like giving a pig more slop. He knows that that's what we want and that's what we want to see. So he's going to keep on giving us, what we want. And he can use that, our love of violence, to poke other holes and be like, hey, did you find this message? Hey, read it again. Go find that message.
And I think that is intentional. I think that it is purposely meant to be ambiguous, because I think that, honestly, that causes some people, and I will say I'm one of them when it comes to some of these, and you admitted just a minute ago talking about Kick-Ass, I think it makes you feel a little uncomfortable. And I think that might actually be his point. Because I think he is making a lot of this overly violent in order to talk about, to deliver that message. So I'll just ask, do you think that he is sparking thought, or is he just trying to provoke us in what he's doing?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think he's provoking us to be sparked.
Yeah. And I think with something like, you brought up Red Sun, I think with something like Red Sun, and Civil War, where the commentary is clearer, it shows that he can be subtle when he wants to be subtle. But even then, I do think that sometimes people miss out on the nuance because they're too focused on, like talking about Red Sun, they're too focused on the what if. What if Superman was a communist? And I think that's where Millar's shock value sometimes does undermine his deeper ideas. So
I'd agree. And something that kind of just talking about a spark in my brain is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like he uses his more well-known superheroes to kind of put the message, it's a little more subtle. You know, he's not going to go super deep and change up Superman too much. He's not going to change the Avengers too much. But when you have characters nobody's heard of, like...
Yeah, but I think that gets into... And we're not going to go off on this tangent. But I think that gets into when he's using Superman, when he's using the Avengers, when he's using Wolverine. These are, you know, Elseworld, multiverse. You know, they don't exist within the main timeline of the comics. So he can do something different. But I also think because he is working with these well-known characters, he is constrained by probably Marvel and DC. You know, hey, you can't do that because this is Superman, or you can't do that because this is Wolverine. Whereas when he's, and this is why, you know, his own stuff is usually completely separated from those universes. You know, with Kingsman and Wanted and the whatnot. I think he's got more freedom. And he can, you know, again, that's why it's called, you know, Millar World. He can kind of just do his own thing. So, yeah, I think at Millar's best, he is using discomfort to challenge his readers.
I agree.
And again, we talked about old, you know, going back to old literature. I mean, you can put a lot of that into, you know, people like Edgar Allan Poe, or, I mean, heck, even H.P. Lovecraft. You know, the underlying messages. You know, so again, at his best, he is challenging his readers, but I will say at his worst, he risks alienating his reader before they get the message. But ultimately, you know, even with our great discussion, I haven't changed. I don't think any of it is accidental. I think he wants to see who will stick around after they get the punch in the gut. I think he wants people to do like you talked about, seeing it one time, and then when you see it or read it one time, and then when you see or read it the second time, you get a whole different experience. And like you continually said throughout this episode, peel back the layers. I think it is all intentional. I think it is what makes him one of the best and one of the greatest, and why his works, along with works of many, many other comic book writers, needs to be considered real literature. And heck, some of this needs to be brought up in school like other books.
Put Millar in the libraries.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on this one-shot during our summer series on Mark Millar. And big thank you to Justin for lending your insight on this topic.
Yeah, once again, thank you for having me.
Hey, remember, everybody, we still got more Millar to come as the summer continues, so stay tuned. But for today, for Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.
From print to screen, the legends stand. Comic kings with the upper hand.